I'm Dr. Daniel Cross-Turner, and I'm Head of Programming and Outreach for the Georgetown County Library System. Welcome to the library series of excellent online programs celebrating South Carolina's deep and diverse food traditions. We call it From Blue Hills to Green Sea, representing South Carolina foodways, and we'll take a culinary adventure all the way from the northwestern corner of the state, the little triangle there with the Piedmont and the mountains, the Appalachian culture there, all the way down to this beautiful green sea we have on the coastline and the low country here. And Gullah foodways we'll be exploring down here. So we'll tie all that together with presentations from an array of prominent foodways scholars. We're grateful for the support in this endeavor of South Carolina Humanities, who made this all possible, and as well as our friends of the Waccamaw Library and friends of the Georgetown Library. Today, we're going to hear a wonderful talk, really a conversation from Chef Kevin Mitchell, a very talented chef, but also a talented scholar. So he's on both sides of the kitchen table, we might say. Chef instructor at the Culinary Institute of Charleston, Kevin Mitchell holds decades of expertise gleaned from his work at notable culinary institutions. He has earned degrees from the Culinary Institute of America, served as chef at Atlanta's Sundial Restaurant, ran the test kitchen for the Gullah Cuisine cookbook by Chef Charlotte Jenkins in Mount Pleasant, and he has acted as chef coordinator for Nat Fuller's Feast, a recreation of a banquet held in Charleston in 1865 by renowned chef Nat Fuller to bring together black and white patrons at the end of the Civil War. Chef Mitchell also brings that scholarly acumen to the table. He earned his master's degree in Southern Studies from the University of Mississippi. In 2018, he researched the impact of Charleston's freed and enslaved cooks on Southern food, and that's what he's going to focus most of his conversation today on. Chef Mitchell serves as South Carolina Chef Ambassador, a member of the Southern Foodways Alliance, and a national board member of Slow Food. Along with Dr. David Shields, Kevin Mitchell co-authored Taste the State, South Carolina's Signature Foods, Recipes, and Their Stories, which is forthcoming this summer from the University of South Carolina Press. And that should be a very tasty title. So here with us, Kevin Mitchell talking about Charleston's freed and enslaved cooks and how they made major contributions to our cuisine in the South and beyond. Bon appetit. We're here with Chef Kevin Mitchell, and we're so delighted to have him. He's the chef instructor from the Culinary Institute in Charleston, and he's in studio with us for a little something special, an interview as his contribution to our wonderful virtual symposium from Blue Hills to Green Sea, representing South Carolina foodways. And Chef Mitchell, we're thrilled to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
For making that trip up Highway 17. It's a nice drive.
It is a nice drive. It is a nice drive.
And you have so many accolades in your bio. You've done it all as a food practitioner. Maybe not all, but you've done a lot of things as a chef and in the food industry. But for decades you've done that. So you've kind of transitioned though, and you moved to the other side of things, to the teaching side and the scholarly side. Mm-hmm. Could you tell us a little bit about that move? From the kitchen, I guess, to the classroom, to the scholar's desk.
Yes.
Really.
Yeah. Well, the journey from the kitchen to the classroom, of course, it's for me started in the kitchen with my grandmother, 6 years old, learning how to cook. Her, well, for one, making me stay in the kitchen. So I grew up in a single parent home. I have three brothers. And of course, my mom worked, and she would send us to grandmom's house while she worked. And my grandmother would allow my three brothers to go outside and play and do all those things. And she would make me stay in the house, in the kitchen with her. And at 6 years old, I go to her. I said, Grandma, how come, you don't let me go outside and play and do all the things that my brothers are doing? And, she sat me down and said, one day, I'm not going to be here to cook your meals and, do your laundry and all those things that, your mom, your mother and I do for you. So you need to learn how to do that. And still my response was like, well, what about the other three that they don't need to know how to cook and do those things? And I just really feel that she saw something in me, because that has been the catalyst, or was the catalyst that guided me into the kitchen, and just seeing, one day watching television and seeing a broadcast on the Culinary Olympics, which is, a big culinary competition, and it's held every 4 years like the Olympics, and they're competing against chefs from other countries. And I just remember seeing these gentlemen in these tall white hats and these crisp white jackets, and they were cooking. And part of it was I didn't see anyone that looked like me. And I just was like really enamored by what they were doing. And I just remember going into my grandmother's room and saying, Grandma, I know what I want to be, when I grow up. She said, well, what do you want to be? I said, well, I want to be a chef. She said, oh, that's great. You want to be, you're going to be a cook? And I said, no, Grandma, I want to be a chef. So I think even then I knew, the differences between, a cook and a chef. And from that point on, it was all about, going into the kitchen. And, I worked in restaurants. I went off to culinary school, got my culinary degree, worked in restaurants for years. And, I worked in the industry, I worked in, hotels. I opened up hotels throughout the country. I worked in country clubs. I even was a chef at Cornell University for a little bit. And, one day I was in Michigan. I was a chef at a casino, and I wanted to, for one, get out of the snow and the cold and move back south, because I was a chef at a hotel in Atlanta at one point, and I wanted to go back south. And I reached out to a friend of mine who had all the insights of, who was looking for, for people or whatever. And I reached out to him and I said, look, I want to go back to the South. I want to get back into it. What do you have for me? And a couple weeks later, he calls me and goes, hey, what do you think about Charleston? And I said, well, Charleston was on a list of places I wanted to visit. I had been reading about the food scene. This was back in 2006, 2007. About the food scene in Charleston and the great chefs, and kind of really trying to dig in deep to the food history of Charleston. And he goes, well, hey, there's a culinary school that's looking for a chef to become a chef instructor, and they're specifically looking for African American because they didn't have any. And what do you think about teaching? And I was like, well, still at that point, I was still really wanting to be in the hustle and bustle of the restaurant world. And he's like, look, just do me a favor. Go down to Charleston, go down to the school, meet with the dean, see what's going on, and then make your decision. And so we finally got in contact with the dean. We scheduled a time for me to come and visit. And I came to the city of Charleston, and I fell in love with it that day, and I got to tour the two campuses at the time and really tried to understand what my life was going to be like, if I was going to make this change. Because in Michigan, I worked in a casino where, I worked 75, 80 hours a week, and I knew I was coming into the educational world where I would probably work half that a week. And so I came to visit once again. I fell in love with the city and fell in love with the history of the city. And I went back to Michigan to think about whether or not I was going to take the position. And I spoke to my grandmother, of course, who was a big inspiration, and my mom as well. And then I spoke to a chef friend of mine who was a director at a culinary school in Michigan, and he convinced me and said, this is the opportunity that you need, specifically because there were no African American chef instructors there. The enrollment for African American students was well over 40%. So it just made sense. And just the fact that I fell in love with the city, and then of course it was out of the snow and cold, it was kind of a no-brainer for me to come here. So that started me on the path to become an educator. And honestly, I'll tell you, in the first year or so, I was smacking myself like, what are you doing? Because it was such a different world from, the hustle and bustle of the restaurant. And then, of course, when you go from working 80 hours a week to only 40, there's a lot of time on your hands now. And I didn't know what to do with that time. Like, should I be at work? I'm not at work. I don't have to teach today. What's going on? So, but after the first year, I kind of fell into it and really started to see, the impact that I was having on not only the African American students, but students in general, who, were there and they were learning from my expertise and the things that I have done in the career. And during that time, I had always wanted to go back to school and get my master's, because at that time I had my bachelor's, and education is very big in my family. With even my mom, and later on in her life, she actually went back to school to get her college degree. And my grandmother did not get a college education, but education was still very big. And I was in a program for education, an online master's program, and I was doing very well. And it didn't really appeal to me, which I know sounds strange as an educator, but it just didn't really appeal to me because I had this passion for this knowledge of trying to understand, the history of, first the history of African American chefs in the culinary industry, based on that television program I had watched at 6 years old and not seeing people that looked like me. And so during this time, I had encountered a really good friend of mine, Dr. David Shields, teaches at the University of South Carolina, and he introduces me to a story of Nat Fuller. And Nat Fuller, at one particular point in the city of Charleston, was the greatest black caterer. Anyone of any stature that wanted a party catered had to go through Nat Fuller. And he introduces me to the story of how at the end of the Civil War, he hosts this, at the time they called it a miscegenation dinner, or mixed race dinner, that celebrated the end of the Civil War and celebrated people in the spirit of equality and also in the spirit of reconciliation. And he approaches me with this story, and he wants to recreate this dinner that he had in 1865 at his restaurant. And of course, for me, very intriguing, because it really tugged on my chef strings and also tugged on that historical string that I was always, wanting to look for. So we got together. Initially, me personally didn't think it was going to really come to fruition. I just thought it was a conversation and that maybe I would hear from him again. And I did 2 weeks later, when he started sending me as much information as he possibly could about the story of Nat Fuller. And so then at that point, I was like, well, I guess we're going to do this. I guess this is going to be something that's seriously going to happen. And we had a meeting one day in Charleston, and we plotted on our course to reconstruct and recreate this dinner. And that was in 2014. So then by 2015, we actually recreated the dinner in April of 2015. Actually, basically almost a year to the date when we actually started planning the dinner. And it also kind of happened not too far after, during that time when the Civil War ended. So getting involved in that dinner and then having that conversation with myself about education and about going back to school. And then another gentleman comes into my life, John T. Edge from the Southern Foodways Alliance, who knew Chef Frank Stitt in Birmingham, Alabama, who saw the story of what we were doing and what we had done with Nat Fuller, and wanted to maybe bring a similar dinner to Alabama, and maybe I would do it at his restaurant. He would offer it as a venue, and we were going back and forth. Unfortunately, with life, it just never really came to fruition. But through our conversations, I was talking with John T, and I said, I really want to go and get my master's, because at that time I knew then I wanted to become a director of my own culinary program, and I knew that I had to have that advanced degree before anyone would look at me. Specifically, even if I wanted to be a director at the Culinary Institute of Charleston. So I said, I need this master's degree. And I said, I was in an education program. I was doing really well. But once again, it did not really tug at me. And he goes, well, based on what you do and what you've done, let's look at Southern Studies. I'm like, okay. And I hadn't really heard about the program at the University of Mississippi at that time. And he was kind of like, he was like kind of like the light bulb, like, duh, Kevin, we have this program. You can come here and focus in on Southern Foodways, because the Southern Foodways Alliance was housed in the same building at the University of Mississippi. And so I applied and got as much information as I could, and I got accepted, fortunately. And in 2016, I packed up my life, put things in storage. I got in my car and I made that 10-hour drive to Oxford, Mississippi, and became a graduate student at the age of 47 years old, which was a whole other experience, being a graduate student and being in a cohort where your classmates are more than half your age. But that's a whole other dynamic. But that experience was amazing because it allowed me to really focus in on the things that I wanted to learn. And being in that program, it allows you to focus in on anything as long as it deals with the South. So, of course, for me, Southern Foodways, Southern food culture, the revitalization of Southern ingredients, and then also my own personal thirst for understanding the history of African Americans in cooking. And 2016, packed up, and then 2018, I walked out with my MA in Southern Studies.
Yeah, well, that is a chock full narrative there, and you were sort of you sent some names. You dropped names, and those are heavy names. Those are big names. If anyone, if you're not familiar with Foodways, those are some of the top folks in Foodways, and John T. Edge, Southern Foodways Alliance, centered at the University of Mississippi, and then David Shields, who you've collaborated with on the book Taste the State South Carolina Signature Foods, Recipes and Their Stories, which is available for pre-sale on Amazon. It'll be out in April. But just a brilliant scholar of foodways. So those are big names. And Frank Stitt, wonderful chef from Birmingham, another. So you're in that circuit. So those are big stars, and you're in that orbit too.
Yes.
You've joined that orbit. So good names to hook up with, and and you had the chops certainly as a chef, and what you'd done for decades, coming over to that scholarly side, and there's personal history, learning from your grandmother who was from North Carolina, correct?
Yes.
So that kind of southern roots, and coming back to the South, really interesting story, and to Charleston, and just kind of brought back to that history. There's a personal connection that you felt almost immediately with the city and its food, but there's also that larger cultural history that's going on. As an African American chef and becoming a chef instructor to inspire other, particularly African American students, but also the history of the city of Charleston and in the larger South in terms of those foodways and what African Americans had contributed. And,
Yes.
and that, once you got to, you kind of sensed that and knew that and had a feeling for it, but you turned that feeling into research, and at the University of Mississippi over 2 years, when you were at Oxford, I get William Faulkner's Stamping Grounds there,
Yes.
Among others. But so, tell us about that. What did you focus on in your research there as you earned your master's degree?
Okay. Well, first, let me I skipped a little thing that also adds to the story. Getting to Charleston and getting into the Culinary Institute of Charleston. See, one of my first duties was to run a test kitchen for a cookbook that was focused on Gullah cuisine. And I, of course, coming from the North, necessarily did not really know or really understand Gullah cuisine, and being able to work with, her name was Charlotte Jenkins, who wrote the book, to really understand Gullah cuisine and how it, the history of it, and how it definitely relates to, foodways specific to Charleston. So that was kind of another thing too, because, you on some levels, when you talk about food in Charleston, you can't not mention, the Gullah culture as it relates to food. So that, within all those other things that I mentioned before, was this big pot of things that was brewing, and getting to the university and being able to research more was great, because for one, I was able to be around people in the Southern Foodways Alliance who focused in on foodways. And it may not have been anyone else maybe in my cohort, but I was able to connect with John T. and with other people that were involved in the Southern Foodways Alliance. And, my professors and those people that were involved were great, because they just allowed me to kind of find my way, which I really liked about the program, because we know most times programs are really regimented and they're strict, and you have to go through certain things, and you have to have certain prereqs or co-reqs. And with this program, it's interdisciplinary, and you can kind of find your way, and that's what made the program really great for me, because anything that I worked on, any papers, even though it may not have been a food related class, I was always able to introduce food into those specific conversations. And it was great. I mean, even in a seminar class, where we're all together and we're all looking at the South from different angles. So, you mentioned earlier poetry and literature. I had a classmate who was, really interested in that, who was really interested in Faulkner. And I had a classmate that looked at Southern clothing, period clothing. And I had a classmate who was into jazz music, because of course we're in Mississippi and we're not far from Jackson and from all those other places that, jazz is what makes Mississippi what it is. So that experience just really opened up the door and allowed me once again to really look at the focus of where not only the ingredients, the techniques, the culture, but also the people. And that was one of the most important things for me, the people. Let's talk about the people and where it all comes from.
Yeah, and that, you just put that in a wonderful way. The idea of foodways, it's about the ingredients and techniques are important to master those and know those, but they're representative of these diverse cultures and histories. That's the idea, that they embody those, and so it's important to know where those come from, where these different dishes, what the history is behind those ingredients and behind those dishes, and also who's preparing them,
Yes.
and who grew the food and where it came from, and especially in the South where so much of the labor, and early on certainly came from enslaved Africans, and so much of the know-how as well.
Yes.
For planting and harvesting and preparing. So it's all tied together, the ingredients and techniques, but also the people and those diverse histories and cultures that they bring into that.
Mm-hmm.
And it blends together
Yes.
as well. It's very, there are lots of different threads, just like in a meal. So it's a wonderful analogy. But that's that idea of foodways. So even if you're in a literature course, you can pick out the foodways in Faulkner, and it does point to a lot of rich histories behind it.
Yes.
And that's so. What was the specific topic that you focused on for your thesis subject once you narrowed down there at Mississippi?
I wanted to focus mainly in on going back to the people. So I wanted to focus in on enslaved African Americans who, who we discuss at length, who in my mind, they build the foundation for Southern food because they were the ones that was doing all the cooking. So I wanted to focus in on the enslaved, and that came from, of course, my relationship with David, who constantly sends me things to look at. We have a Dropbox file where he just dumps things and he goes, keep this in your back pocket, do with it whatever you want. So he sends me a list of ads. And these ads basically are for the sale of enslaved people, but based on their cooking and culinary skills. So in my research, specifically in my thesis, I dedicate a full chapter to really talking about the ads, talking about what they mean to me, and just trying to interpret or decipher what they mean and why they were in existence too, and why, someone would go to the newspaper to purchase a enslaved cook, and to talk about the agency that they had, right? They had agency because they were skilled laborers, and a lot of times when we talk about enslaved people, we look at the really dark atrocity of it, which we must.
Yeah.
However, for my work, I wanted to bring the positive part to it. Like, I really wanted people to understand that these people were skilled. Despite some of the things that we learn about where slaves were not allowed to learn how to read and write. These enslaved people had to know how to read and write. They had to learn how to deal with money because they would go to the market to purchase the food that they would cook for their masters. So I wanted people to see that perseverance, that the intelligence that they had despite their condition. So that was kind of the focal point, but also wanted to tie in. We talk about the ingredients. So I wanted to tie in, the ingredients from the African diaspora that, we talk about making up the Southern food, soul food, Gullah cuisine, whichever you want to call it, canon. Like, where did these ingredients come from? How did they get here to America? So on and so forth. And then, once again, going back to the people, the ads was a way for me to give voice to those that did not have a voice. Also, give a name to those people. Because in those ads, it just says, for sale. One, black or mulatto, male or female, their age, French cook, pastry cook, and complete cook. So I wanted to give a name to those cooks. Also, going back to people again, also focusing in on the enslaved or formerly enslaved or even freed cooks that we know of, the names. So the Nat Fullers and the people that come before him and the people that come after him. And so basically looking at the people, of course, food, ingredients, techniques, and then, of course, some of my own personal history and the connection that I have to what I wrote and why I wrote what I wrote and why I wanted to write it and how is it connected to me. So, we talk about the ingredients again. So we talk about where they come from, how they get here, what they are, who grew them, what do they mean, and what is the connection to the ingredients and people, and how Southern food in general, we may have the same ingredients, but we're cooking very different dishes, right? So I wanted also people to understand that Southern food is not just it's Southern or soul, so it's fried chicken, it's mac and cheese, it's this. No, I wanted them to look at it more regionally as well and understand that the South is made up of different regions. We use ingredients the same, but we make them in different ways. So I just wanted to make that connection so people understood that though I may be making peas in Charleston, somewhere else in the South, someone's making peas, but they may be making them very differently.
Yeah. So even within the region, the South, there are nuances. There are lots of different.
I mean, if we talk about a specific dish, if we're talking about Hoppin' John, right? We know Hoppin' John basically is rice and peas, but there's one camp that says you should use field peas in the making of this dish. There's another camp that says you should use black-eyed peas, right? So getting people to understand they're in the pea family, but they're still very different. And for an example, in class, we were talking about starches and grains in this one class, and one of the recipes we were going to execute was Hoppin' John. The recipe I gave the students had black-eyed peas in it. Well, one of my students, protested and would not. She told me, she said, I will not make this recipe if we're using black-eyed peas, because where I come from and how I was raised and how I was taught, that you always use field peas. So, and that's kind of the beauty of food. Like, the nuances, things are the same, but they're still very different. So I wanted, all those things to kind of come out in the research, in the thesis that I wrote, so people can understand, and specifically connected it to Charleston, mainly because I live in Charleston. Those are the people that I write about.
Yeah. So you kind of bring to life these Charleston enslaved and freed cooks through using those ads as a basis, looking in who were they were kind of blanked out in those ads, their property, and were just bartered, in the newspaper ads. But in your research, you go through and try to give them voices and names where you can, and follow their paths.
And I also wanted to let people understand that those specific enslaved people were always available through private sale, right? So we talk about slavery in general, how they're marched up on a block and they're for sale in the public eye. But these skilled people were always available by private sale. So in the ad, it would also tell you where to purchase, like what brokerage firm you can go to purchase that cook. And then just decipher the differences between the complete cook, French cook, and a plain cook or whatever, and talk about their skill level. And then one of the most important things I wanted to get out was their value. Their value monetarily, and their value just as a person that had skill. Right. So, and I would say that was somewhat of a hard chapter for me to write personally, to look at a group of, and I had about 100 ads just kind of looking through. And for me as an African American, looking at this sheet that David sent me that has these ads for the sale, when you really boil it down, it's for the sale of human bodies. Like, it was, for me, it was really hard to, I couldn't even fathom. And I was really, of course, as a historian, as someone that's writing a scholarly paper, you don't want to inject your own personal feelings because you're writing a scholarly paper. But that was a hard chapter for me to write, just based on what I was looking at, and then trying to decipher and talking about, well, as a enslaved cook, you were worth more in money and also just overall value because you had a skill than someone that was not a cook or someone that was not skilled.
So that there was that hierarchy, and cooks were they at the top, would you say, or they were pretty close to the top?
They were pretty close to the top because they, because they also had to have other skills. They had to know how to keep house and clean, and they had to have seamstress skills and cleaning skills, and of course rearing children.
And they were,
specifically if they were in the big house, and those are the cooks I focus in on the most. Because just based on those ads, and just based on once again that agency that they still had to walk around the streets of Charleston enslaved, but carry a slave badge. But still go to the market, still pay, bring the receipts back to the mistress of the home, and then prepare meals.
They had, and you used the word agency. There is agency there. They had a whole lot of responsibility, that was placed on them with the structure of the slave system there, burdens of labor.
Yes.
But they also had they had agency. They had influence in that house. You can imagine. I mean, it's within the limits of slavery. They had to carry that badge. They had to, their movements were watched. It was contained. But you can imagine they had to be trustworthy. They had to be trusted, and they were controlling the health of that family. And I guess the enjoyment of that family to how well prepared the meal is. They had a lot of influence interacting with the master's children.
Yes.
All these things that it's not. It complicates that kind of traditional story to really think of them. These cooks living their lives out, that they really did have a kind of agency, and they mattered. They were important, and affected all these other lives. And even as they become kind of, I guess, abstracted out, or just they become that line on the blotter, and with a dollar sign beside it to be sold. But they, your thesis, your research tries to flesh out that, and embody their lives and give them voices. So, and they were really important. Your argument is to the history of Charleston, and the history of Charleston food and cuisine as well. They really influenced what would become. It's really Southern cuisine now. It's a lot of these dishes. So, could you say something about that? That we, it's what we call Southern cuisine, or it didn't just come out of nowhere. We can trace where it come from, and that's another kind of agency on a bigger level. That a lot of it came from these cooks.
Yes, and that is one of the most important things I try to get a point to when I speak to anyone, is for them to understand that it came from somewhere, and it just didn't pop up, right? And I take very seriously, my duty as someone to expose people to those stories, and expose people to the understanding that that's where it comes from. We have to give credit, and we have to really, when we talk about food, Southern food, soul food, low country cuisine, I mean, there's so many different words for food, and it's hard to kind of stand in one box, specifically as a chef, because as a chef, food is food, and food is wonderful, and it's great, and everyone you cook food, and I go home, and I'm an African American, but I'll go home and I'll make pasta, right? But it's for me, it's still food. Sure. But also, you have to really make a point of giving the credit where it's due, and that's the most important thing. And as a chef, for me, I just want people to enjoy food, and it's great to have these very complex discussions about food, but at the end of the day, it's still food, and it's something that we live on. We have to have food to live, outside of water and other things, but it's just a beautiful thing, and having these conversations and being able to flesh out whatever it is that we're trying to flesh out, but still at the end of the conversation, we're still talking about food, right? And giving that credit is the most important thing. And that's really one of the missions that I'm on, is to get people to understand that.
And it is, that's one of the things about food. It is, can't live without it. We can't live by bread alone, but we do need the bread.
Yes.
And so we all have to have food. It's a necessity, but there's also, a chef. We like to have something with our bread, and the chef. It's also enjoyment. It's about gathering together and having eating customs too, and all this, like the dinner, the Nat Fuller dinner, and can have all these other customs and rights attached to food. So we have enjoyment related to food, as well as the necessity of health, and so it's that matter, and the ingredients, like a lot of those ingredients in soul food come from some, like rice, Carolina Gold rice from west coast of Africa, and had to be cultivated by the folks who knew how to grow it.
Yes.
So it's from West Africans, enslaved West Africans. And then, the cooks who were preparing that, the enslaved cooks, they would, there's room for agency and creativity in the way they prepare it. They might, do it a little different this way and that way. But so they do have that, some creativity, even though overall it's, obviously the history, as you mentioned, it's a dark history, but there is some of slavery, but there is some, you're focusing on kind of, I guess, restoring some of the light to that history, or I guess some of the buried aspects, or trying to celebrate what should be celebrated, the creativity of those cooks, the talent of those cooks, enslaved cooks, despite their the conditions of slavery, enslavement. They still had that kind of impact that you can go around and eat in the restaurants today around Georgetown, around Charleston, and you can still, you can put it in your mouth today. It's still with us.
Yeah, and it's just, for me, I've always felt like, as a chef, what makes me a better chef is knowing the history of the food that I'm making, knowing the history of the ingredients, knowing where it comes from, because it allows for me to have a greater respect for where it came from and for what those ingredients are and how to use them. So, and I try to impart that a lot in my class. I know a lot of students, well, why do we have to understand that, it's just rice? No, it's not just rice. It has a really huge, complicated, beautiful, tragic history attached to it. Yeah. And in order for you for me, in my opinion, to be a great chef and to properly prepare that rice, is to understand what that history is. So it's just very important for future, specifically in my classes and for my future chefs to understand that history. And I'm not telling them that they all should go out and get their master's degree and pack up and, because a lot of my students, when I was doing that, when I was making the announcements, they thought I was crazy. They were like, wait a minute, you're going to move to Mississippi and you're not going to be cooking professionally for 2 years? And I'm like, I mean, I cooked a lot at home and that was it. But being able to bring back that research, that knowledge, those things that I gained in Mississippi back to the classroom, now students are starting to understand. Like, okay, I understand why you did what you felt you needed to do.
Yeah, it gets to that, you can prepare a meal or enjoy a meal, and it's a surface level, but this gets to that whole deeper history beneath it. And it is, food does have all that centuries deep. You can go with certain foods like rice that you mentioned, or, field peas versus black-eyed peas. Some of us would make in Hoppin' John just, whatever, throw whatever in there. But it matters historically, or to, for certain people from a certain place, it's important to their identity which peas you're going to throw in there. And so, as a chef, it's important to be aware of those, of that history, or more aware. So it's all wound up in the culture, and especially in the South, when there's been so much, there's been a lot of conflict and division, and you can kind of see it in the food. Although, as you're saying, there's some convergence too. And let me ask that: what would you see as points of convergence? Can food offer us some points of connection?
I mean, I definitely feel that food is, growing up, my grandmother would always tell me that food is one of the things that brings people together, because at the end of the day, we all have to sit down and eat, whether we eat together or not, or whether we're eating the same type of food, or whether, our culture in food is very different. We all sit down to a meal at a table. It brings people together. But also food has an opposite effect because, as we're having these conversations, we realize that food also brings people apart, and, it just goes back to, and I'm not going to get the quote right exactly the way it was, but John Edgerton, who was the original executive director of the SFA, makes a comment on how people from different cultures were all involved in the production, the cultivation, so on and so forth of food. But when it came to eat the food, we all separated and went our own, and we went to our own people. So it was white or black or whatever, and that was one of the main things I learned that by studying foodways was, yes, my grandmother is right, but there's still this other side of it that, where we have to have these complicated, hard, dark conversations. And I think having the conversations is a great way to also have a connection. And once we get through the conversation, once again, still it's food, and we're gonna sit down and eat this bowl of Hoppin' John or Purloo or whatever it is, and we're gonna enjoy it because it tastes good.
It's got that pleasure, and we need it. It's a necessity, but it's that pleasurable experience, and it gives us lots of food for thought and discussion too. When we are thinking about the history that's really, and the history of the labor involved and all of that, and so there are a lot of separations and divisions in there, but hopefully there are some points where we can sit down at the table and come together, and positive cultural convergences over food as well, which seems important down south, and that was what inspired that original Nat Fuller dinner. Was trying to reconcile. There are still some controversies about that in some Charleston restaurants about kind of appropriating or white-owned restaurants or white-run with typically white executive chef, taking a dish associated with Gullah culture and putting that on the menu. What would you say about that? Is that cultural appropriation, do you think? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, that's a hard question to respond, as a chef, because we want people to eat really great food, and we want to cook great food. And like I said, I will go home and make pasta, which is not African American.
Sure.
I will go home and make stir fry, of course, things like that, right? And I think the conversation of cultural appropriation, I think what really matters is that the person that is cooking or doing whatever it is giving the credit of where it comes from, and not standing on his or her own as the authority of a specific type of cuisine. And that's kind of, maybe that's kind of like the historian side of Kevin Mitchell. The chef side is like, hey, I love paella, and I'm gonna, if I understand, how to cook it, I'm gonna make it. And and I have an example. Earlier in my career, when I was a chef at a hotel in Michigan, I ran a restaurant that was based on Asian cuisine. The food was Asian with, some American influence, but it was definitely Asian, a lot of Asian ingredients, Asian recipes, techniques. And we had a group of people come, it was in the Westin Detroit hotel that's connected to the airport. And we, not Southwest, there was an airline that had a huge Chinese clientele, and they would fly into Michigan and they would eat in the restaurant. And one day there was a group of 8 or 9 of them, and they were having dinner in the restaurant, and server comes in the kitchen and says, "Hey, chef, these guys want to see the chef." I'm like, "Okay, great. Okay. Hopefully they want to see me for something good, but okay." So I go out to the table, and they're all engaged in conversation. So, of course, I want to give them their time to finish their thoughts. And I'm standing there, and there's no way you can't tell that I'm not the chef. I mean, I'm in full chef garb. I have a hat on. You can't, and for a while, no one acknowledged me. And I just stood there respectfully. And eventually, someone looked up, and I said, "Did someone want to see the chef?" And they all looked at me like the deer in the headlights, and couldn't understand. And one of the gentlemen was like, "Well, how are you the chef cooking Asian food?" And of course I had to be very respectful, but I had explained, and I always explain to people, as a chef who does research, who looks at recipes and studies cuisine, if I understand the ingredients, of course, as a chef, I should definitely know how to read a recipe. If I understand the culture, I should be able to cook that food. Now, never did I ever say, these were my own personal recipes. Right. I am the authority of Asian cuisine in this restaurant. And I think that's where people get really crazy when we talk about cultural appropriation without giving credit, and for me, it's also about without maybe giving back to that community. So when we talk about Gullah culture and the Gullah food, and we're talking about specific chefs who have garnered major reputations and even a great bit of financial gain off of this particular food, and they're not giving credit to where it comes from, and they're not, for me, giving back to that specific community. That's where I think the problem lies, right? And when the media portrays them to be the expert, the savior, or whatever, that's where the issue is. And when people say, "Well, how do they give back to the community?" That's a very open-ended question, because you can do many different things. And I've always said, "Well, hey, these chefs, they see they can hire some of these people from that community to work in their kitchens and help them maybe achieve some of the culinary goals that they want to achieve." Right? So maybe there's a gentleman or a lady in their kitchen who is from that community, but they want to go to culinary school. Yeah. Okay, why don't you, I'm not saying you have to pay for their education, but you are a person in a position of power, and you have a stronger voice than that individual. So you can find a way to help that individual try to achieve whatever their goals are, right? So, I mean, there's so many things that, there's not always a right answer. Well, how do they give back to the community? There's not a right answer. But if you make the attempt, if you, of course, or when you're writing your menu, you support local providers who bring you the ingredients that you're using to make that dish. So, I mean, there's just so many things that you can do. And, it's, that question of cultural appropriation is a heavily debated. It's a big I write a little bit about it in my paper, and I give, some examples as it relates to food, even examples as it relates to clothing or style of dress or hairstyles, but once again, the chef in me that loves food, it's good, and I've been asked, when Paula Dean was kind of going through some of her personal and professional issues, I got a call from a reporter from I believe the New York Times, who wanted to goad me into these questions, and they just specifically asked me, well, what do you think about white people cooking Southern food? And I said, well, don't white people live in the South? Like, I think sometimes we make a larger deal out of something than what it really should be. You know, for me, when I go to a restaurant and I see something on the menu, I'm interested in it because of the way it's described. Then in my mind, I'm like, I'm going to order it. I just want it to taste good. Now, if they're, giving the credit, if they're writing something on the menu, or in interviews, they're saying that, hey, this is, hey, if you, as a white chef, if you love Gullah food, that's great. But say it. Just say, hey, I really love this food. I want to be able to prepare it. I want to give credit to where it comes from. And I want to talk to the people that actually create it. So, I mean, we can talk about that in Gullah. We can talk about it, I reference Rick Bayless as it relates to Mexican food. And even for me as an African American, I grew up in New Jersey. I'm from the North. So my only connection really to Gullah is the fact that we are both African American. Like, I didn't grow up in that culture. Right. So even people, when I was doing the testing for that cookbook, would ask me, well, what do you know about Gullah food? And I would just kind of like, that's why I'm doing this, because I want to learn about the beauty of this food, and I want to really understand the culture. So when I talk about it, when I cook it, I give it the respect it deserves.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Very good. Well, how about could you say, just give us a couple of examples of major contributions that have come from enslaved cooks to Low Country cooking or Southern cuisine? Just
the first one major is, of course, the cultivation of rice. Yeah. Right, rice weighs heavily in what people were eating in the 1800s. Specific dishes that come from, we talk about Hoppin' John. Yeah. We can talk about purlus, which are, one pot rice dishes, very similar to, Hoppin' John is a purlu if you really want to break it down. So this just the food, the cuisine, the recipes, and even the ways you use some of the ingredients. Like, I write about the ingredients, so I write about bene seed, bene, true original sesame seeds that come to us from Africa that are being cultivated here in America, in Colombia and Anson Mills, but using bene seeds as a thickener, almost like a gumbo filet, using those seeds, or the oil that is pressed from bene is very important because it was the main cooking fat of people in Charleston in the 17 and the 1800s. Until, of course, with the advent of, cheaper, for lack of a better word, cheaper types of oils being produced, it was the most popular. I mean, it was so popular, Thomas Jefferson tried to grow bene in Virginia and was not very successful, right? And thanks to people like, Glenn Roberts at Anson Mills, who are bringing back these heirloom ingredients that were cultivated by the enslaved and putting it in front of chefs. And that's the greatest thing. These chefs are using these ingredients on their menus, and I'm a huge proponent, whether it's bene or rice or Sea Island red peas, of course, okra, okra is kind of the quintessential ingredient that comes to us from Africa and can be used in so many different ways. The oil, you can dry it and grind it into flour. Of course, it goes in gumbo, or, it goes in okra soup, which is a, quintessential Gullah dish. So, you know, there's just so many things, and this, and then of course, it's the contributions of African American chefs who are like myself, who are trying to bring this information to the forefront so people really understand where it all comes from. But once again, making sure that understanding and giving that respect.
Yeah, and no, kind of unburying that buried history is part of it, and even to the extent of regrowing those heirloom ingredients so that chefs have access to that to recreate the meals, but really reconstructing the history, making sure that because this is not a history that most people know, or at least not directly. It's kind of been in the background. There, there was a cook who was cooking at these big houses or on the plantations, but it's sort of a shadowy figure. And now, bringing the enslaved cooks and then the freed cooks into focus, and then African American went after the Civil War, African American cooks, and then bringing that lineage more into view, and all the contributions that's kind of shining a light on that crucial part of Southern foodways in general, which of course are not just tied to the South, and that's become a huge part of the foodie scene.
I mean, the food of the South is it's a hot ticket. I mean, you can go to New York and up north and places and find restaurants where chefs are dedicating their food to Southern cuisine, and that's great, because they're with people like Anson Mills and other producers, they are able to supply these chefs. As far as California, excuse me, with Carolina Gold rice and Sea Island red peas.
Yeah. So it's that fascinating things that you've done with your research as a scholar, and you keep doing, and as a teacher, as the chef instructor, and you're also South Carolina chef ambassador. So you help spread the word there too about all these important elements, and so this is a great contribution to what we're trying to do with this project, this virtual symposium, from Blue Hills to Green Sea, representing South Carolina foodways. So you represented well. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you.
Kevin Mitchell. And again, that book with Dr. David Shields, Taste the State, South Carolina's Signature Foods, Recipes, and Their Stories, coming out from the University of South Carolina Press, and that'll be in August 2021, but you can already pre-order it on Amazon and other booksellers.
Yes.
But
it's going to be a great book. It's
two excellent scholars, and right here from South Carolina on South Carolina foodways. So we're delighted that you're here with us, Kevin, and thanks so much.
Thank you for having me. It's great.